The dawn light cut through the lovely stained glass of the Rose Kingdom, casting across the throne room floor a beautiful scene beyond compared. Dust motes danced in the fractured beams, settling over the ruins of a once great hall. Sharon stood at the center of the silence. Princess Sharon reached out, her fingertips tracing the love divinely in her living space, with Yahweh as also her provider. The rock felt unstable under her touch, a physical reminder of the kingdom's precarious state. She pressed her palm harder against the stone. Princesses. Sharon is with her father, King Tony, having some me time with her father in the evening, while they talk with each other in the royal living room together. They have a beautiful time. Together. King Tony is also in the library with his daughters, Princesses Sharon. They both had some me time while reading, or looking up books together to read of they past family heirs. Queen Myrna is in the royal living room, having some me time with her daughter, Princesses Sharon, giving her friendly advice to live by. Her eyes is looking into Sharon's eyes to confirms her love. The warmth of her skin contrasted with the morning warmth of the hall. Sharon looked up, meeting the gaze of her mother, the monarchs with love and happiest. Princess Sharon's in the front of her palace home, sitting on a bench with her brother, Prince Dave, and Princess Charmaine's. They three have me time together as siblings and loving it. Princess Myrna leaned in. Her voice is full with love as she talked to her daughter, Princess Sharon, with a resonant tone. The royal family gathered together: Queen Myrna, her son Prince Dave, and two twin daughters, Princesses Charmaine and Sharon. They were in the palace winery, seeking the perfect wine for their quest tomorrow. Love and respect is often found in the people who stand behind you in moral support. Family, who is filled with love and they present as members, who does have love for everyone they come in contact with. Princess Sharon felt the truth of her royalty vibrate in her own chest. She closed her eyes for a moment while listening to her own heartbeat, letting the instructions settle into her mindset. As Princess Sharon opened her eyes to Yahweh-given miracles which revealed themselves to her, she nodded to sharp, decisive movement which changed her life on speed dial with Yahweh grace and mercy. Queen Myrna loved her royal children dearly. Princess Sharon was an exception to the rule. Beyond these iron doors, her stance was in Yahweh, Yahusha, and Holy Ghost as a child. The lies told about they exist and was covered by deceivers, who told themselves lies and believed these lies told to themselves as truth, while stealing the identity of others for mass wealth and control. Princess Sharon and her sister Princess Charmaine was a gift of love to their parents, King Tony and Queen Myrna. They were loved by all they true people, who knew who their real identities were. Prince's Dave stood near the golden and marble gate. He posed to the camera for a royal shot, while glad in his golden armor. Prince's Dave is standing outside the Rose Kingdoms taking a pictures with a beautiful smile on his face. He is beyond handsome, as a princess of royalties. Princess Charmaine inhale the wonderful breeze as she look on the rosebush valley of beauty. Princess Charmaine stands at the pink and white, golden marble gates. She has on a beige and black royal gown. Princess Sharon and her sister Princess Charmaine walk to the center of the outdoor palace gates of pink, golden, and white marble interior designs. They have on matching gown as twins also. Princess Sharon leads her brother Prince's Dave toward the massive gates. Their backs are turned toward the cameras. They look through the pink, white, and gold design marble gates. As they passed through the threshold, the familiar safety of the walls fell away. Sharon did not look back. She kept her eyes on the path ahead, her boots striking the ground. Princess Sharon and Prince Dave is looking through outer gate, the pink, white, and gold marble stone wall. Behind her and him is clear as the light of day and palace, with pink, gold, and white. Beyond the walls, the manicured stone of the kingdom gave way to a tangle of wild, overgrown brush. The path was no longer a road, but a narrow, winding vein of dirt cutting through dense, encroaching forest. Sharon led the way, her boots sinking slightly into the soft, uneven soil. The transition was immediate. The air here was cooler, smelling of pine needles and decaying leaves, a sharp contrast to the stale, metallic scent of the fortress. Dave moved to the flank, his eyes scanning the dense tree line for any sign of movement. Charmaine took the rear. The group slowed as the trail narrowed, forcing them into a single file line. Every step required more effort, more focus. She pushed through a thicket of thorns, her pace steady, leading her team deeper into the shadows of the unknown. The forest canopy abruptly vanished, replaced by a horizon that defied geometry. They had reached the crystal water realm. Sharon took a step forward and felt her weight shift. The ground beneath her boots seemed to pulse, losing its solid resistance. Above them, massive spheres of water hung suspended in the air, motionless and clear as glass. They did not fall. They simply drifted, refracting the light into jagged, distorted patterns that danced across the team's faces. Dave reached out to steady himself against a floating mass of liquid, his hand passing through the surface without breaking the tension. Charmaine drew her blade, the metal humming in the strange, pressurized air. Every movement here was a struggle against the shifting pull of gravity. They moved in a crouch, testing the density of the air before committing their weight to each stride. The silence was absolute. Princess Sharon saw a shifting maze to confuse her mind, while seeking to hold her hostage to her environment. But putting her mind to this maze, she was able to escape her demise, set for her. Sharon drifted away from the group, drawn by a sphere of water that hovered toward her at eye level. It was larger than the others, its surface swirling with a milky, iridescent sheen. As she approached, the liquid surface smoothed into a perfect, polished mirror. She saw herself, but the background was wrong. Instead of the floating, surreal landscape, the reflection showed the Rose Kingdom throne room. It was a hollow shell. Sharon froze, her breath hitching as she watched her own reflected image turn its head. It leaned forward, the liquid surface rippling as if the image were pressing against a glass pane from the other side. The team called out to her from behind, but their voices were muffled, distorted by the dense atmosphere. The reflection's lips parted, and a voice emerged. "You cannot save them all," it mocked. The reflection's eyes narrowed, judging her with a cold, hollow intensity. Sharon stood motionless, her pulse thudding against her ribs. She did not recoil. Instead, she reached out, her fingers trembling as they made contact with the surface of the sphere. The water was unnaturally cold, biting into her skin like ice, yet she did not pull away. The liquid swirled around her fingertips, trying to drag her hand into the depths of the vision, but she pressed harder, anchoring herself against the pull. She leaned into the chill, closing her eyes to shut out the sight of the ruined throne room. The voice echoed again, a taunting whisper. She opened her eyes, meeting the gaze of her own reflected face. "I may not save everyone," she whispered, her voice steady and clear, "but I will never stop trying." The moment the words left her lips, the sphere shuddered. A hairline fracture appeared in the center. The water burst into 1,000 droplets, dissolving into a fine, cooling mist that washed over her face, leaving the air clear. The mist hung in the air for a heartbeat, then vanished, leaving only the faint scent of ozone. Sharon stood still, her breathing deep and rhythmic. The oppressive weight that had defined the realm seemed to lift, replaced by a sharp, focused clarity. She turned to find the team watching her from a few paces back. Dave stepped forward first, his boots crunching on the crystalline ground, his eyes searching hers for any lingering doubt. Charmaine followed, her hand dropping from her blade as she saw the change in Sharon's stance. There were no questions asked. The silence between them was no longer heavy with uncertainty. It was charged with a shared, quiet purpose. Sharon nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement that signaled the end of their hesitation. They moved as one, their footsteps synchronized against the glassy terrain. The floating spheres of liquid that had previously blocked their way now drifted aside, as if pushed by an unseen current. The path forward stretched out, clear and unobstructed, leading them toward the horizon where the sky began to shift in color. They did not look back at the place where the illusion had held them. The air changed within 100 yards. The crisp, clean scent of the water realm evaporated, replaced by the dry, metallic tang of scorched earth. Sharon led the group over a ridge of jagged rock, and the landscape ahead shifted into a landscape of raw, pulsing heat. The ground beneath their boots was no longer solid stone. It was a rhythmic, glowing expanse that ebbed and flowed like a living lung. Every few seconds, a low vibration traveled up through their souls, a deep thrumming that made the teeth ache. Sharon signaled a halt, raising her hand as the heat intensified. The air rippled in front of them, distorting the horizon into a shimmering orange haze. Suddenly, the earth fractured. From the glowing cracks, thick stems shot upward with violent speed. Fire roses burst into existence, their petals unfolding in jagged, flickering arcs of flame. They did not bloom so much as they ignited, casting long, dancing shadows against the valley walls. Sharon stood at the front, her skin flushing under the sudden, intense radiation, watching as the valley transformed into a wall of living, burning light. The fire roses shuddered, and from the heart of the flames, shapes detached themselves. Creatures of swirling smoke and jagged embers surged forward, their forms shifting with every erratic movement. They did not walk, they poured across the scorched earth like a tide of hot ash. Dave reacted instantly, his blade whistling as he carved a wide arc through the thickening haze. The smoke parted briefly, only to reform behind his strike, closing the gap with predatory speed. Jimmy and Terry slammed their shields together, the metal ringing out as they formed a rigid, impenetrable wall against the searing heat waves. The impact of the creatures against their shields sent sparks flying into the air, illuminating the chaos in blinding flashes. Charmaine moved between the gaps in their defense, her blade a blur of motion. She fought with a savage grace, striking down the encroaching shadows. Before they could find a foothold, the air grew thick with the smell of sulfur and burnt iron. Every time a creature dissolved under her blade, it exploded into a shower of embers that hissed against their skin. They were locked in a tight, desperate circle, the heat pressing in from all sides, while the creatures continued to pour from the glowing ground. Sharon stepped into the eye of the chaos, the center of the swirling embers. She needed to break the cycle of the fire, to reach into the roots of the valley and force a calm. She planted her feet, ignoring the searing temperature that blistered the air around her. She reached out, palms open, and pushed her energy outward, a wave of cool, restorative intent, aimed at the glowing soil. The reaction was immediate and violent. The fire roses did not accept the healing. They drank it. The golden light she projected was swallowed by the crimson flames, turning the heat from a steady burn into a blistering white-hot roar. The ground buckled beneath her. Sharon gasped as the feedback slammed into her, a physical weight that forced her to her knees. Her skin flushed a deep, angry red, and her lungs burned with every shallow breath. She tried to pull back, but the energy was locked, the valley siphoning her strength to fuel its own growth. The roses flared, casting a blinding glare. The fire was a predator, and it was winning. The roar of the fire roses filled her ears, a deafening, rhythmic thrumming that matched the pulsing ground. Sharon pressed her palms into the scorching dirt, the heat biting into her skin, but she stopped pushing back. She stopped trying to impose her will upon the valley. Instead, she focused on the air entering her lungs. It was thick, metallic, and hot, yet she drew it in slow, deliberate cycles. She closed her eyes, shutting out the blinding glare of the flames, and listened. Beneath the chaotic crackle of the fire, there was a deeper, slower beat. It was the pulse of the earth itself. Her heart, which had been hammering against her ribs, started to decelerate, matching the cadence of the valley. The heat, once a violent pressure, began to shift. It felt less like a weapon and more like a conversation. The transformation began at the roots. Where the fire roses had once clawed at the air with jagged crimson hunger, they now shuddered and stilled. The intense, blistering heat that had choked the valley floor evaporated, replaced by a gentle, radiating warmth. Sharon opened her eyes. The petals of the roses were no longer flickering like tongues of flame. They were unfolding, their edges softening into a brilliant, radiant gold. The color bled outward, washing over the scorched earth like a tide of liquid sunlight. Dave lowered his guard, the tension leaving his shoulders as the air cleared of smoke and embers. Jimmy and Terry stepped back, their shields no longer vibrating from the heat, and looked toward the center of the valley. The path, previously blocked by walls of fire and shadow, now lay open, bathed in a soft, golden glow. The ground beneath their boots felt solid and cool. Sharon stood, her movements fluid and steady, and signaled the group forward. The valley had ceased its resistance, yielding to the harmony she had established. The golden light of the valley faded behind them, swallowed by a sudden, unnatural stillness. As they crossed the threshold into the final stretch, the temperature plummeted. The sky above, once clear, curdled into a thick, charcoal gray. It was a heavy, suffocating color that seemed to drain the vibrancy from the world. Ahead, the dark fortress rose from the jagged landscape like a splinter in the earth. Its spires stretched upward, piercing the low-hanging clouds. Lightning began to arc across the stone peaks, not in flashes of warmth, but in jagged violet veins. Each strike illuminated the fortress walls, revealing a dense, tangled web of thorns that clung to the masonry. These were not ordinary plants. They were twisted, metallic growths. The team slowed their pace. Dave gripped his weapon, his knuckles white, as he scanned the perimeter for movement. Charmaine stood at the front, her eyes fixed on the massive, iron-bound gates that stood slightly ajar. The air grew thin, smelling of ozone and ancient, stagnant dust. They had reached the heart of the shadow. The path behind them was gone, replaced by the looming, silent weight of the fortress walls. The final stage had begun. Sharon pushed the heavy doors inward. They groaned on rusted hinges, revealing a cavernous hall that swallowed the sound of her footsteps. Inside, the air was stagnant, heavy with the metallic tang of trapped energy. The walls were smooth, dark stone, devoid of the thorns that choked the exterior. In the center of the chamber, the heart-bloom crystal hovered, casting a rhythmic, throbbing light that bathed the floor in shifting shades of violet. Sharon stepped forward, her boots crunching against the grit on the floor. She did not look at the shadows in the corners. Her focus was drawn to the figure standing before the light. Mr. Morris remained perfectly still. He did not turn as she approached, his silhouette sharp against the pulsing glow of the crystal. He seemed to draw the light into himself, his presence cold and utterly indifferent to the intrusion. Sharon stopped 10 paces away. She waited for him to speak, but the only sound was the low, electric hum of the crystal. Morris stood as a statue carved from the dark, his gaze fixed on the core of the room. He did not acknowledge her arrival, his posture rigid and detached. The silence between them stretched, thick and suffocating, as the light from the crystal flared. Morris finally turned. His movements were slow, deliberate, and entirely devoid of urgency. He gestured toward the heart-bloom crystal, his hand tracing the air as if he were already carving his name into the world. "This world is built on power," he said, his voice flat, cutting through the hum of the chamber like a blade. "It is a simple equation. Those who claim it, own it. Those who hesitate, perish." He took a single step toward her, his eyes reflecting the jagged violet light of the core. Sharon did not retreat. She planted her feet on the cold stone, her gaze locking onto his. "Power is not a trophy to be hoarded," she replied. "It belongs to those who share it. It grows only when it is given away." Morris let out a sharp, dry sound that might have been a laugh. He looked at her with pity, his posture radiating a cold, absolute certainty. The air in the chamber grew heavy, pressing against Sharon like deep water. Every breath she took felt thick, charged with the static of the heart-bloom crystal. The violet light began to pulse faster, a rhythmic strobe that turned the stone walls into a blur of shifting geometry. Morris did not blink. He stood rooted to the floor, his fingers curling into tight, jagged shapes. As he began to draw the ambient energy toward his palms, a faint, dark mist started to coil around his wrists. Sharon watched the transformation, her own muscles coiled and ready. She took a slow, deliberate step toward the crystal. Morris shifted his weight, his stance widening, his eyes narrowing into slits of pure, calculated malice. Sharon reached out, her hand hovering inches from the pulsing core. The world held its breath, suspended in the final second. Morris moved with the suddenness of a viper. He lunged, his arms snapping forward, and the dark energy he had gathered lashed out like a whip of solidified shadow. It cut through the air with a high-pitched whine, aimed directly at Sharon's chest. She did not flinch. She pivoted on her heel, her body turning in a fluid, desperate arc. As the dark lash swept toward her, she thrust her hands forward, channeling a surge of pure, blinding light from her core. The two energies collided. With a sound like shattering glass, a shockwave erupted from the point of impact, throwing dust and debris across the chamber. Sharon felt the force of the blow vibrate through her bones, a crushing weight that threatened to buckle her knees. She held her ground, teeth gritted, her light pushing back against the encroaching darkness. But Morris was relentless. The light shattered. It did not fade. It broke into jagged fragments of brilliance that vanished into the encroaching gloom. Morris did not hesitate. He stepped into the opening, his hand striking Sharon with the force of a falling stone. The impact sent her reeling backward, her balance lost, her arms flailing against the sudden vacuum of power. She hit the floor hard. The stone was unforgiving, biting into her skin and knocking the breath from her lungs. Her vision blurred, the edges of the room turning into a swirling vortex of charcoal and gray. She tried to push herself up, but her muscles refused to obey, trembling under the weight of the exhaustion that flooded her limbs. The darkness was not just an absence of light, it was a physical presence, a heavy, suffocating blanket that pressed against her chest. She could hear the rhythmic, mocking pulse of the heartbloom crystal somewhere above her, but it sounded distant, muffled by the ringing in her ears. She lay still, the cold of the floor seeping into her bones. The shadows tightened, a cold vice around her throat. Then, a sensation cut through the suffocating dark. It was the phantom weight of a hand on her shoulder, steady and warm, grounding her against the stone. The memory hit with the force of a physical blow. She saw her mother's hand, calloused and firm, guiding her through the first lessons of the kingdom. The image shifted, sharpening into the sight of her father, his jaw set in pride as he watched her master the blade. She felt the phantom echo of his approval, a rhythmic pulse that matched her own slowing heart. Then came the flash of the gates, the smell of ozone, and the sight of Charmaine standing beside her, sword drawn, eyes locked on the horizon. The loyalty in that gaze was a physical anchor. The cold stone beneath her palms began to vibrate. She felt the grit of the floor against her skin, the sharp edges of the debris, and the biting chill of the air. The darkness was no longer a void, but an obstacle. She forced her fingers to curl into fists, the muscles in her arms locking, and the shadows recoiled. The shadows hissed as they broke, retreating into the cracks of the floor. Sharon did not wait for the strength to return. She demanded it. She drove her palms into the cold stone, the sharp grit biting into her skin. Her muscles screamed in protest, a white-hot spike of pain radiating from her side. She ignored it. She shifted her weight, locking her knees, and forced her torso upward against the crushing pressure of the room. Her breath came in jagged, shallow gasps, each one tasting of ozone and stale dust. She pushed until her spine straightened, the movement slow and deliberate. Her vision cleared, the gray haze thinning until the room snapped into focus. There, suspended in the center of the chamber, the heartbloom crystal pulsed. She did not look at Morris. She did not acknowledge his presence or his stance. Her eyes were fixed on the core of the fortress. She wiped a streak of blood from her temple, her hand steadying as she planted her feet firmly on the uneven ground. She took one step, then another, the stone floor crunching beneath her boots. She was no longer pinned. She was moving, and her gaze never wavered. She reached the base of the pedestal. The air here was dense, vibrating with a force that pushed against her chest like a physical wall. The heartbloom crystal hovered just inches from her reach, its light flickering with a jagged, erratic rhythm. She extended her hands. As her fingertips brushed the surface, a shock of cold energy surged up her arms, forcing her fingers to spasm. The crystal hummed, a high-pitched whine that vibrated through her skull, attempting to repel her touch. She did not pull back. She dug her heels into the stone, bracing her entire frame against the repelling force. She slammed her palms flat against the pulsing core. The surface felt like solid light, unyielding and sharp. She ignored the stinging sensation in her skin and the way the energy tried to whip her hands away. She closed her eyes, focusing every ounce of her resolve into the contact. She did not try to seize the power or claim it for herself. Instead, she pushed her intent through her palms, a singular, unwavering command for unity. She felt the crystal shudder under her grip. The crystal groaned, a sound like grinding tectonic plates, before it began to bleed light. It started at her fingertips, a soft, golden glow that bled into the surrounding gloom. Sharon kept her palms pressed flat, feeling the stone beneath her hands heat up, not with fire, but with the warmth of 1,000 suns. Suddenly, the light surged. It erupted in a violent, beautiful spectrum of color that tore through the chamber. Violet, gold, and deep azure light lashed out, carving through the shadows like a blade. The darkness shrieked as it was forced back against the walls. Sharon watched as the light took shape, manifesting fragments of everything she had fought for. She saw the faces of her people, the laughter in the kingdom. These were not just memories. They were physical manifestations of unity, burning with an intensity that made the stone floor tremble. Sharon stood at the center of the storm, her arms outstretched, the light pouring through her as if she were a conduit. The darkness had nowhere left to hide. The Heartbloom crystal could no longer contain the pressure. Hairline fractures appeared across its surface, glowing with a white-hot intensity that eclipsed the surrounding light. Sharon felt the vibration travel through her arms, a rhythmic thrumming that threatened to rattle her very bones. The stone groaned, a high-pitched, metallic screech, as the fissures deepened and widened. She did not let go. She leaned into the core, her weight pressing forward as the crystal began to splinter. Small shards of light broke away, suspended in the air. The sound of the cracking stone grew louder, echoing off the fortress walls like a series of thunderclaps. It was a violent, final sound. With one last, massive surge of force, the crystal gave way. It shattered into a million brilliant fragments. The explosion was not a blast of fire, but a wave of absolute clarity. A shock wave of pure, blinding light tore through the chamber. Sharon stood amidst the falling dust of the crystal, her hands still extended into the empty air, as the last remnants of the gloom vanished. The fortress did not just react, it began to die. A deep, guttural groan vibrated through the floor, the sound of stone protesting against its own weight. Above, the vaulted ceiling buckled. Massive blocks of masonry shifted, grinding against each other as the mortar turned to dust. Sharon watched as the cracks raced up the pillars, spiderwebbing across the dark stone like veins of lightning. The very air grew heavy, with the smell of pulverized rock and ancient, stagnant earth. The walls began to lean inward, then outward, losing their structural integrity as the dark magic that had bound them evaporated. A section of the western wall collapsed, sending a cascade of debris tumbling into the inner chamber. Dust billowed out, thick and gray, obscuring the far corners of the room. The floor beneath Sharon's feet tilted, forcing her to brace against the shifting ground. Every archway shuddered, the keystones falling one by one. Stone by stone, the fortress surrendered its form, the ceiling finally giving way to the open sky above, leaving only the skeletal remains. The light reached Mr. Morris, hitting him with the force of a physical blow. He stood rigid for a heartbeat, his hands clawing at the air, as if trying to grasp the vanishing darkness. Then, the change began. The dark energy started to bleed away, leaking from his pores like smoke in a gale. His posture, once unnaturally upright and imposing, began to sag. The bones in his shoulders cracked audibly as his frame lost its artificial height. He stumbled backward, his feet dragging across the uneven stone floor. The air around him shimmered, distorting his silhouette until he seemed to fold in on himself. He let out a sharp, ragged gasp, the sound thin and hollow. His knees hit the cold stone with a dull, heavy thud. He tried to push himself back up, but his arms trembled, unable to support his weight. His stature continued to shrink, the sharp angles of his face softening, the intensity in his eyes flickering out like a dying coal. He remained there, hunched over, his hands splayed flat against the debris-strewn ground. The aura of command had evaporated, leaving behind only a man, small and shivering in the center of the ruins. He was broken, kneeling amidst the dust of his own ambition. The roar of the collapsing stone died away, replaced by a heavy, ringing silence. Outside the fortress perimeter, the air remained thick with gray dust, but the unnatural pulses of dark energy had ceased. Where smoke creatures had surged only moments before, there was now nothing but cooling embers and scattered ash. Dave stepped out from behind a jagged slab of masonry, his boots crunching on the debris. He wiped a layer of soot from his face, his chest heaving with every breath. He scanned the perimeter, his eyes tracking the horizon for any sign of movement. There was none. Jimmy and Terry emerged from the shadows of a fallen archway, their shields lowered and held at their sides. They moved with a slow, deliberate pace, their movements heavy with exhaustion. They met Dave near the center of the clearing. No words were exchanged. The absence of the enemy was enough. The wind picked up, carrying away the last of the acrid smoke, revealing the clear, darkening sky above. They stood their ground, weary but resolute, as the reality of the victory settled. Sharon emerged from the jagged gap in the fortress wall, her movements slow and deliberate. She stepped over a fallen beam, her boots finding purchase on the uneven stone. She paused, scanning the clearing where the team stood. Charmaine saw her and did not hesitate. She dropped her guard, leaving her weapon resting against a pile of rubble. A blessing of heavenly host sprinted across the lovely earth. The distance which was between the sisters vanished in seconds. Charmaine reached Sharon and pulled her into a tight, crushing grip. The impact forced the air from Sharon's lungs, but she did not pull back. She leaned into the contact, her hands gripping the back of Charmaine's shoulders to steady herself. They stood locked together, their foreheads resting against one another as they caught their breath. The silence of the battlefield returned, but the tension had shifted. There was no more chaos, a need for a sisterly hugs of love from Princess Sharon, given to her sister Charmaine, with tightening grip, a physical show of sisterly love. Charmaine released her grip, and they stepped apart, the space between them filled with the quiet rustle of shifting roses. Dave, Jimmy, and Terry moved to join them, their boots crunching rhythmically against the broken stone of the fortress floor. They turned to the beautiful valleys, heading toward the path that led back to the Rose Kingdom. The ground was uneven. There were beauty everywhere in the Valley of Roses, forcing them to navigate carefully as they left the site of the battle behind. Above, the sky began to bleed into deep shades of violet and gold. The light caught the edges of the distant hills, casting long, sharp shadows that stretched out before them. They walked in a loose formation, their pace measured and steady, conserving what remained of their strength. No one spoke. The only sound was the rhythmic thud of feet on dirt. With every step, the fortress faded into the growing darkness behind them. The air cooled rapidly, the heat of the struggle replaced by the crisp, biting chill. They kept their eyes on the horizon, moving forward as the sky deepened into a rich, bruised purple. The kingdom waited in the distance. The iron gates of the Rose Kingdom loomed ahead, their surface scarred by the recent conflict. The group stopped at the threshold, the heavy metal groaning as Sharon pushed them open. Inside, the garden lay in a state of suspended decay, the soil dry and the stems brittle. Sharon stepped onto the stone path, her boots stirring a layer of fine, gray dust. She stopped near the center fountain. Suddenly, a sharp, rhythmic snapping sound echoed through the courtyard. It came from the nearest rosebush. A bud, previously tight and colorless, jerked open. Its petals unfurled with a visible, rapid motion, revealing a deep, iridescent teal that caught the dying light. Beside it, another rose burst into a vibrant, pulsing silver. The movement spread like a ripple through the entire garden. Stems straightened, shedding their withered leaves. The air filled with the scent of damp earth and fresh nectar. Sharon reached out, her fingers hovering near a bloom that shifted from violet to a glowing, translucent gold. The color bled into the surrounding air. Dave and Charmaine stood back, watching as the entire garden transformed. The kingdom was no longer a place of shadow. It was a sanctuary of light, reborn from the soil itself. Sharon led the way toward the heavy oak doors of the royal court. As she pushed them open, the silence of the garden was instantly replaced by a wave of sound. The hall, once cold and hollow, now vibrated with the rhythmic hum of strings and the sharp, bright notes of a flute. Laughter bounced off the high, vaulted ceilings, mingling with the chatter of people who had emerged from the shadows of the city. Tables were pushed to the edges of the room, leaving the center clear for movement. People stood in clusters, their faces illuminated by the warm, flickering glow of lanterns. The air smelled of roasted grain and spiced wine, a stark contrast to the ozone of the battlefield. Sharon stepped into the light, and the music swelled, drawing the attention of the crowd. Men and women turned, their eyes wide, their voices rising in a chorus of recognition. They moved toward her, not with the stiff formality of subjects, but with the unbridled energy of those who had been granted a second chance. The heavy, oppressive weight that had hung over the kingdom for so long had vanished, replaced by the chaotic, beautiful pulse of a society finding its rhythm again. Sharon slipped away from the warmth of the hall, stepping back into the cool evening air of the garden. The music faded into a soft, rhythmic thrumming behind her. She walked toward the center fountain, where the water now flowed with a steady, clear pulse. A single rose stood near the edge, its petals a deep, vibrant crimson that seemed to hold the last of the sunset. She reached out, her fingers brushing the velvet surface of the bloom. The texture was firm, alive, and entirely real. She pulled her hand back and turned to look out over the kingdom. Below the terrace, the city lights flickered in the dusk, no longer dimmed by shadow or fear. She watched the people moving through the streets, their silhouettes small but purposeful. The heavy, suffocating weight that had pressed against her chest for months had finally dissipated, leaving a strange, quiet space in its wake. She took a deep breath, the air smelling of damp stone and blooming flowers. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of damp earth and fresh nectar across the terrace. Sharon remained motionless, letting the cool air wash over her. She watched the garden, noting how the plants had shifted from the jagged, defensive forms of the war to something softer and more resilient. Every leaf seemed to hold a new, steady vitality. She turned her gaze toward the palace walls, where the cracks from the recent struggle were already being mended. There was no sound of shouting, no smell of ozone, only the rhythmic, peaceful activity of a city reclaiming its own life. She closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the distance between the chaos of the valley and the stillness of this garden. The darkness that had threatened to consume the horizon had been pushed back, leaving a clear, open space in its wake. She exhaled slowly, feeling the tension drain from her shoulders. This was the result of the struggle, a tangible, breathing peace. She stood in the center of the garden, a witness to the quiet, and let the reality of the moment settle deep into her bones. Sharon looked at her reflection in the still water of the basin. The face staring back was familiar, yet the eyes held a depth that had not been there before the march. She traced the line of her jaw, feeling the phantom ache of the battles she had survived. She was no longer the person who had hesitated at the iron gates, waiting for permission to act. That version of herself had been stripped away by the fire of the valley and the cold of the fortress. She flexed her fingers, testing the lingering strength in her grip. The journey had not just reshaped the kingdom, it had forged a new foundation within her. She understood now that the silence of the garden was not a final destination, but a brief, necessary pause before the next climb. A sudden, sharp gust of wind rattled the nearby leaves, but she did not flinch. She stood firm, her balance absolute. She knew the horizon would eventually bring new shadows, and she knew she would be the one to meet them. She drew a long, steady breath, feeling the air fill her lungs with purpose. The past was a closed chapter, and the future was a vast, unwritten expanse. She turned away from the water, her posture straight, and her gaze fixed on the path ahead. She was ready. A single rose caught the light near the stone bench, its petals unfolding in a shade of gold that seemed to pulse with its own internal warmth. Sharon stepped closer, the gravel crunching softly under her boots. She reached out, her fingertips brushing the velvet texture of the bloom. It was firm, alive, and entirely real. The sight of it triggered a shift in her expression. The lingering tension around her mouth softened, replaced by a slow, genuine smile. It was not a smile of relief, but one of quiet, ironclad hope. She stood there for a long moment, watching the garden breathe. Around her, the rows of flowers swayed in unison, a sea of vibrant color reclaiming the space where shadows had once dominated. The camera moved outward, sweeping across the terrace to capture the full expanse of the grounds. Everywhere the eye traveled, the signs of growth were undeniable. New buds pushed through the soil, and the air hummed with the sound of insects. This was the landscape of a new era. Sharon remained in the frame, a steady presence, looking out at the world with eyes that were finally, fully awake. Beyond the garden walls, the city began to hum with the sounds of restoration. Carpenters hammered at the gates, their rhythm steady and synchronized. Citizens moved through the streets in lines, passing stones and timber from hand to hand, a chain of effort that spanned the entire square. Sharon watched from the terrace, noting how the people worked without the fear that had once defined their movements. This was the true harvest of their struggle. The unity they had forged in the heat of the valley and the cold of the fortress was now woven into the very mortar of their homes. She saw Dave and Charmaine walking the perimeter, their presence no longer that of soldiers, but of guardians ensuring the peace held firm. Every stone laid today was a promise for the next generation. The kingdom was no longer a fragile thing held together by decree, but a living structure supported by the collective will. She felt the weight of that responsibility, not as a burden, but as a solid, unshakable foundation. The sky deepened into a rich, clear blue. She looked toward the horizon, where the sun began its slow descent. The path ahead was long, but for the first time, the foundation was secure enough to carry them all. Sharon turned her back to the city and faced the open expanse beyond the kingdom's borders. The morning light had shifted, shedding the pale hues of dawn for a brilliant, saturated gold that washed over the plains. There were no shadows left to hide in. The Rose Valley on the landscape, light with a warm foreboding, were now softened by the warmth of the sun. She stood with her feet planted firmly, her spine straight, her hands resting at her sides. Every muscle in her frame was relaxed yet alert. She scanned the horizon where the earth met the sky, searching for nothing in particular, simply observing the vastness of the world she had helped reclaim. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and blooming life. She took a deep, steady breath, feeling the cool wind against her face. She watched as the light caught the distant peaks, turning them into beacons of amber and bronze. She did not look back. Her gaze remained fixed on the line where the sun continued to rise. She was ready. The horizon was no longer a boundary, but a beginning. The golden light intensified, washing over the rose plains, until the landscape sunbeams became a single, radiant glow, which lighted on her brow. A deep orchestral swell rose in the air, filling the silence with a resonant, triumphant chord. Sharon remained motionless, her silhouette framed against the brilliance. The world she had fought for was no longer a dream. It was the reality unfolding before her. As the music reached its peak, the vibrant colors began to bleed. Princess Sharon is now conqueror by Yahweh grace and mercies. All her enemies is in the past. She knew in all her adventures, Yahweh had her back as an overcomer of evils when hurled towards her.